early 1810s, within a small convent room in Dülmen, Germany, and Catherine Emmerich entered a phase she later described with restraint, a season when familiar inner light faded, and prayer unfolded without response, leaving her attentive, waiting, uncertain how silence itself might be shaped. For years before this period, Emmerich's faith life had been marked by steady interior communication, moments she understood as divine closeness. Yet, during the same decade, that rhythm ceased entirely, not gradually, but with a sudden absence that unsettled her habits of trust and endurance. She recorded that prayer continued daily, disciplined and exact, but without consolation, as though heaven had withdrawn behind an unseen veil, forcing her to remain present in the practice of belief while receiving nothing that could confirm whether her words were heard. This interior quiet did not feel neutral. It pressed inward, testing resolve rather than emotion. And within her confined space, she began to confront the possibility that faith might persist, even when spiritual dialogue, once constant, offered no reassurance or recognizable sign of return. In the Westphalian countryside during those years, external life continued unchanged. Bells rang, seasons turned, visitors came and went. Yet inside her narrow cell, time seemed suspended, measured only by unanswered prayers and the steady decision to remain faithful without sensory reward. Emmerich later noted that the silence felt deliberate rather than accidental, not abandonment but withdrawal, a condition that stripped devotion of feeling and left only commitment, exposing how belief functions when sustained solely by choice rather than interior warmth or visible affirmation. Her writing suggests that discouragement approached slowly, not as panic, but as erosion, a quiet wearing down of expectation, where hope survived in principle, even as emotional certainty weakened under the prolonged weight of days passing without any perceived response. Unlike dramatic trials, this season offered no external conflict, no opposition or persecution, only interior stillness. And in that stillness, she faced a question familiar to many believers: whether faith remains meaningful when its most intimate expressions appear unanswered. The early 19th century provided no language of psychology for such experiences, so Emmerich framed them theologically, interpreting the absence as permitted, perhaps even purposeful, a stage meant to refine obedience rather than reward devotion with immediate consolation. As this period unfolded, the silence itself became the defining event, shaping her inner posture and preparing a threshold not yet crossed, where endurance, rather than vision, would determine how her spiritual path continued beyond the quiet that had unexpectedly taken hold. As the silence continued through the early 1810s, and Catherine Emmerich's daily discipline intensified rather than softened. Her prayers measured by routine instead of feeling. Each hour observed carefully, as though faith itself required structure to survive, when interior confirmation no longer accompanied belief. Within her small room in Dülmen, physical weakness and illness remained constant companions. Yet the deeper strain came from uncertainty, the effort of maintaining trust without reassurance, where perseverance demanded attention, patience, and the willingness to remain faithful without emotional or spiritual feedback. She described moments when discouragement pressed heavily, not erupting suddenly, but accumulating quietly, a gradual realization that spiritual effort would not be met with immediate response. testing whether devotion rested on experience or on commitment, formed long before this season began. Unlike earlier years marked by vivid inner imagery, this phase offered nothing to interpret or record, only repetition, prayer, silence, rest, and pain, forming a rhythm that stripped belief of ornament and reduced it to endurance, practiced day after day without variation. In the broader context of early 19th century Germany, religious life followed established patterns, yet Emmerich's struggle remained invisible, unfolding privately, untouched by public devotion, leaving her isolated within an experience few could observe, explain, or meaningfully accompany. She noted that doubt did not take the form of denial, but fatigue, a slow exhaustion of expectation, where faith persisted intellectually, even as emotional assurance diminished, forcing her to confront belief as obedience rather than consolation or spiritual satisfaction. This interior trial sharpened her awareness of limitation, revealing how little control she possessed over spiritual experience, and how obedience required acceptance of conditions not chosen, endured without explanation and sustained only by trust, shaped long before the silence began. The absence of divine response also altered her sense of time, days stretching longer, nights heavier, as prayer continued without interruption, reinforcing a discipline grounded not in inspiration, but in fidelity, maintained through habit and conscious resolve. In writings from this period, Emmerich refrained from dramatic language, presenting the trial plainly as something permitted rather than imposed, suggesting that the silence functioned as a refining process rather than a punishment or sign of spiritual failure. By enduring this prolonged stillness, she entered a deeper confrontation with faith itself, where belief stood exposed, unsupported by vision or consolation, preparing the ground for an outcome not yet visible, but shaped through patience exercised within sustained uncertainty. When the silence eventually eased, it did not arrive as sudden return, but as gradual openness, leaving Catherine Emmerich changed, her trust less dependent on sensation, shaped instead by endurance learned during years when prayer continued without reply or emotional assurance. In reflections recorded later, she treated that season as formative rather than exceptional, suggesting that faith matured there, stripped of comfort, anchored by obedience, and tested within ordinary days that offered no extraordinary sign to explain their purpose or promise of relief. This understanding shaped how her experience was later received within the church, not as spectacle, but as witness, illustrating how spiritual credibility can emerge quietly when perseverance replaces visible grace and meaning, unfolds without insistence or immediate clarity over extended periods of waiting. In Dülmen, during the final years of her life, the memory of silence remained present, not as wound, but as reference, a measure by which later moments of consolation were understood with restraint rather than expectation or emotional demand shaped by discipline learned earlier. Those who later read her writings noticed how little emphasis she placed on relief, focusing instead on what endurance revealed, namely that faith, once detached from reassurance, could sustain itself through memory, habit, and conscious fidelity, practiced across prolonged interior trials, quietly endured. The silence, when viewed in retrospect, became less an absence and more a threshold, marking transition from experiential devotion toward a steadier form of belief capable of remaining present, even when spiritual language temporarily withdrew within ordinary human limitations, accepted patiently over time. In the context of early 19th century Catholic spirituality, her experience aligned with patterns long recognized, where withdrawal precedes depth and where silence functions not as rejection, but as refinement within lives committed to disciplined prayer sustained through routine, illness, and solitude daily. Rather than concluding with restored visions, her story settled into continuity, showing how the earlier silence permanently informed her posture, teaching discernment, humility, and caution toward extraordinary experience, even when others later emphasized those elements within devotional memory, interpretation, and transmission carefully. By the early 1820s, as her health declined, the meaning of that silent period appeared settled, no longer contested internally, but integrated, leaving her anchored in trust that did not require reassurance to remain intact amid ongoing suffering, prayer, and dependence quietly maintained. What remained in the Church's memory was not its silence itself, but what it produced. A testimony that belief can persist without exchange, sustained by fidelity, restraint, and quiet perseverance, long after the need for explanation fades within lived Christian witness across generations enduring.